Welcome to the Dough Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 333, I'm going to talk about something, well, kind of a little different for this show. It's not going to actually be, at least not directly, about money. I'm going to share with you some things I've been doing to, well, I guess try to learn stuff. I'm going to talk about some things I've been reading and a note-taking system that I've started to use and why I've started to use it. Now, all of this can certainly be applied to personal finance and investing. And in fact, that's one of the things I do because, well, I write and think about money quite a lot. So that's what I want to do today. And it came about from a New Year's resolution. I wanted to read more in 2020. And at the beginning of the year, I thought about how I wanted to go, think through that and go about doing that. And, the sort of normal sort of New Year's resolution, I thought, well, maybe I'll just try to read one book a week. At the moment, or at the time, I was reading this thing right here, the biography of Hamilton. If you've read it, well, even if you haven't and you're watching the video, it's kind of thick. I suppose I could, in theory, get through this in a week, but I wasn't quite sure that was maybe the best approach. So what I decided to do was instead read 25 pages a day. That was my New Year's resolution. I actually got that idea from Shane Parrish of the Farnham Street blog. And so that's what I started doing. And it's now in the middle of June 2020. And I've pretty much stuck to it. I would say I've read 25 pages a day, at least 90% of the time. And it's often the case that I'll read more. I try to get my reading done early in the morning. And then I find, in the afternoon, I just kind of need a break. And for me, a break can often be just reading some more. So, there are certainly days where I've read 30 or 40 or 50 pages. So that's what I've been doing, and raises one question. So what have I read? Well, as I mentioned, I finished Hamilton. I'd started this last year and finished it at the beginning of this year. And I've read actually a lot of biographies and autobiographies. I really enjoy them. I read How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee. Very interesting book. My favorite so far of all of the books I've read this year, and this isn't even really close, is the autobiography of Malcolm X. If you've never read this book, I tell you, I learned so much about so many different things in this book. But, if someone had asked me, so what do you know about Malcolm X? I mean, I knew who he was, but honestly, not much more than that. This was a phenomenal book. I read The Chief, a biography of William Randolph Hearst, the publisher. He could not help himself. He spent every dime he ever came into his possession and 100 dimes beyond that. He would buy artwork, expensive artwork from around the world that he would never see. It would just get put into a warehouse and he never saw it. It was an illness almost, but a fascinating book. I've read Small Fry. This is by Lisa Brennan Jobs. Yes, Steve Jobs' oldest child. And she's a strong person. This was Steve Jobs, whatever we think of him in terms of, what he did at Apple and I guess Pixar for that matter, he was not an easy person to get along with. Anyway, I read the biography of Robin Williams. This was a hard book to read too. I grew up with Mork and Mindy, right? I remember him on Mork on Happy Days, actually, where he got his big break and then it became Mork and Mindy. And but life wasn't always funny for Robin Williams. In any event, I've read some math books. I read The Code Book, excellent book on cryptography, phenomenal book. I've read, let's see, what else do I have? Oh yeah, The Joy of X, not sex, X, another math book. It's basically a math book for English majors, which is what I am. That was great. I know this is a lot of books, isn't it? I read Journey to the Ants. Ants are remarkable. I read actually Shane Parrish's book, The Great Mental Models, kind of patterned after Charlie Munger, who's the business partner of Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway. So interesting book. I read the manual of the Warrior of Light. I thought this was just okay. Let's see. I'm almost done. I read Homo Deus, The Brief History of Tomorrow. which, by the way, most of this book is not about tomorrow. It's about yesterday. But it pays off in the end, I thought. I read Fahrenheit 451. Honestly, don't know what all the fuss is over that book. And Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living. And a couple more. I read Fermat's Enigma. So this is an interesting book. It's actually written by the same author who wrote the code book. So you're familiar with a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? The whole right triangle thing that we all learned in school. Well, there was a math problem that said, okay, we know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that there are whole numbers that can solve that equation, right? Such as 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared. But what about if we, instead of squaring those numbers, what if we cube them or take them to the 4th power or the 5th power? And we can just go on and on until infinity. Are there any whole numbers that solve those problems? The answer, as it turns out, is no. Now you might think, well, how in the world do you actually solve that, though? I mean, you can work out maybe cubed, maybe, I don't know, but then there's this whole infinity thing that seems to be like, how do you actually get to infinity? Well, there was a mathematician, Andrew Wiles, I believe his name was, or is, who solved this thing. And he spent his entire life on this math problem. And this book is about that, the history of the problem, where it came from, and how it got solved. Fascinating book. In it, and actually this is in the foreword of the book, the authors, of course, speak to Andrew, the mathematician who solved it. And he was talking about what it was like to have solved this centuries-old problem. And one of the things he said about it was, he talked about his sense of loss for the problem that would no longer be his constant companion. He'd solved it after 30 years or so, and that was great. But it really was sort of his purpose in life, certainly in his career. And now that purpose was gone. And that's a hard thing to deal with. And I wrote in the notes, there's no greater purpose in life than tackling a problem that takes a lifetime to solve. By the way, I'm not sure if that's actually true. I'm sure we could come up with maybe a greater purpose. But this was relevant to kind of what I'm going to talk about today. Because I thought, I really want something that I work on the rest of my life that's never done. We do a lot of things where we do it and it's over and it's done and it's packaged and there you go. We ship it, we do whatever. But I wanted something that would never be done. What would that be for me? And as I went through all of these books, I've read a fair amount this year. I thought, well, how much of what I've read do I actually remember? I mean, obviously, I don't have a photographic memory. So there are going to be plenty of facts that I read, for example, about Hamilton that I'm never going to remember and probably don't need to. But could I, for each of these books, say, well, here are the 3 things that I really got out of this book, or 5 things, or whatever. And as I do things like this podcast, or I do a YouTube video, or I write, can I take different anecdotes and other things that I've learned from these books and incorporate them? Like, for example, I did in this podcast from Fermat's Enigma. And the answer I came to was, well, no, I can't actually. I mean, I mark up books as I read them, which is why I prefer to read physical books rather than, say, on the Kindle, at least for nonfiction. So I certainly, I guess, could go back through each of these and see what I underlined. But I mean, that's not a very practical approach to thinking and learning. And so all of those questions sort of came together. I thought, I really want a note-taking system that I can use. And maybe that's the thing that I'm never finished with. That over my lifetime, however long, until that bus comes around the corner and takes me out, and my wife has to open up the blue binder, what can I do? What can I work on? And the answer was, maybe this is actually what I can work on, this note-taking system. And so the system itself, I did some research, and I discovered a note-taking system that was patterned after a sort of a social scientist who had created this system, and his name is Niklas Luhmann. I want to make sure I get the name right. Yes, Luhmann. So And by the way, the book I'm looking at now is a book I've also read this year called How to Take Smart Notes by, I'm going to mess his name up. His last name is Ahrens, Ahrens. And the idea behind the note-taking system is pretty straightforward. And let's apply it to money, for example. So, I do a lot of reading on obviously on investing. And so one of the things I've talked about in the past is the 4% rule. So I've read a lot of articles about the 4% rule. And if I wanted to save them, whether it was in a physical file or on my computer, maybe in folders, we tend to think about organizing stuff in folders. You can think of the old filing cabinet with folders in it, or your computer where you have folders and subfolders. And so you can imagine I might have a 4% rule folder, and everything I read about the 4% rule would go into that folder. But then you start to think about that. You think, well, one of the things about the 4% rule that's important is asset allocation. The 4% rule doesn't work for just any old asset allocation. You need, according to the study, somewhere between 50 and 75% in stocks, even in retirement. So then I start to think, well, so it relates to asset allocation, but now where do I put it? I mean, asset allocation isn't just about the 4% rule. It's much bigger than that. So I'm probably going to have an asset allocation folder, but what do I do with something that sort of relates to both? Which folder does it go in? And yes, I struggle over things like this, so you should feel very sorry for me. One option would be, well, I'll just duplicate something and put it in two folders. And certainly that's easy to do if it's online. But then what if I change one of them? Then I have to remember to go change the other. Or if I'm taking notes on one, do I put notes in both folders? So one solution to that is, rather than taking sort of a top-down approach, which is really what the folder approach is, we can also, in addition to that, take a bottoms-up approach and use tags, right? And you're probably familiar with that, whether you use Evernote or anything else. I think any sort of organizational framework today thinks in terms of folders and then tags. So for example, for my 4% rule articles, I could tag them with maybe an asset allocation tag. And that's helpful. It links it to asset allocation. It raises some questions, though, is that as I'm going through this system, am I going to necessarily see that link? I might, depends how what I'm looking at. I try to think, well, I'm very familiar with the connection now, but if I'm researching something 3 years from now, am I going to remember that 3 years earlier I made this connection? So tags can be helpful, but I'm not sure it solves the problem. And so what Lumens did, and I want to make sure I get his name right again, but what he did, and his system was all physical. It wasn't computer-based. But what he decided to do was, in addition to sort of categorizing them, yes, Lumen, in folders and tags, he also made direct connections between the individual notes that went in his system. Now, he used index cards and pieces of paper. So you can imagine if he had an index card that covered the 4% rule, on that card, he would specifically link to a card that he had on, say, asset allocation. He might also link to a card that he had on inflation and on sequence of returns risk. And maybe he had a card on William Bengen, who was the financial advisor who wrote the 1994 paper that sort of ushered in what we now know as the 4% rule. And maybe he would have links to other advisors that have written a substantial amount on the 4% rule. So he's directly connecting notes. So yes, there could be folders. Yes, there could be tags, but this direct connection with notes. And when you talk about something like the 4% rule and say asset allocation, at least if you're me and you're thinking about this all the time, I'm probably not going to forget that connection. But then there are other connections. So for example, going back to How to Take Smart Notes, this book that I just finished, in the book, the author talks about the idea of complexity and how complexity is a real issue in many fields, and it's a problem to be overcome. And you could think certainly there's complexity in behavioral science, there's complexity in any sorts of engineering fields, certainly coding, there's complexity, industrial design. And there's always this struggle to make things as simple as you can, but not too simple. And he actually applies it in the context of this note-taking system, because what his view is, we want the system, the framework, to be as simple as possible so that we can have the complexity where we want it and that's in the individual notes. But I thought, that absolutely applies to investing and to the 4% rule. There are all kinds of dynamic spending rules that advisors have come up with to sort of replace the 4% rule. Maybe that's for another podcast. But the point is, some of them are really, and I think unnecessarily complex. They would be, I think, too difficult for the average person, myself included, to implement. And I don't want to go to an advisor and pay an advisor 1% a year when I don't need to. And so, it occurred to me there's an absolute link to the 4% rule and the idea of complexity, which could be in notes that are in folders and tagged in ways that are completely unrelated to the 4% rule, except that in my system, I have connected the two. I have a connection now between the 4% rule and this idea of complexity. So that's really the power behind the note-taking system, is that over time, as you have more and more and more notes in this system, you'll start to see connections that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. And in fact, I don't have that many notes in my system. For those watching the video, I'm going to show you the software that I use in just a minute. I don't have that many notes. I mean, probably maybe fewer than 50. But imagine when I have 3,000. And they're not just about money. It'll be about everything that I read, which, as you've seen from the list I gave you a few minutes ago, it's pretty eclectic, I guess. In any event, my expectation is I'll start to see connections between what at first seems like very different fields, very different topics, and hopefully it'll make me, I don't know, maybe a little smarter. We'll see. So that's the idea behind the note-taking system. They call it a Zettelkasten, Zettelkasten. If you Google Zettelkasten, this note-taking system, you'll get all kinds of information. So as I mentioned, this book, How to Take Smart Notes, describes this system, I think, quite well. Another book that I'm reading, and let me pull it up, it's actually an ebook called Taking Smart Notes with DevonThink. And I know what you're thinking, Rob, what's DevonThink? Well, DevonThink is the software that I use to keep all of these notes. When you think about a note could be something I've just typed up myself. It could be an article. For example, Benjamin's 1994 article on the 4% rule is a note in my Zettelkasten, in my note-taking system. And then when I want to write a note myself that relates to the 4% rule, I can link to his paper, if it makes sense. And for that matter, can link to any other note in the system. So for those watching the video, I'll show it to you very quickly. You're looking at sort of a high level of my Zettelkasten. And I divide it in a couple of ways. I do use folders to a point. I use one folder for people. So any historical figures that I want to keep track of, that I read about, I put in a people folder. I keep track of quotes in a separate folder, in part because I want to use it in my writing. And so I can go just to those quotes folder and see what quotes I have. I have a reference file, which is where I put all of the PDFs, white papers, books that I read. So all of the books I've mentioned at the start of this show will end up in the reference file. All of the white papers and other online articles that I read about, whether it's the 4% rule, the bucket strategy, whatever, go in the reference file. And then when I'm writing a note that relates to one of those references, I can link to it in the note. And then I also have a folder for words where I keep track of the definition and usage and history sometimes of words that just strike my fancy as I'm reading. And then the main part of the system is just called slip notes, which was just the term that they gave to the system and the notes. And that's where the vast majority of notes will live. And I'm not, within that slip notes folder, I'm not further I have a few subcategories, but for the most part, I'm wanting all of my notes to just live and breathe in the same bucket, even if they're about very unrelated things. And so we can go into the slip notes real quick. Here's one that I took. It's on the Dunning-Kruger effect. it talks about how it's basically the imposter syndrome, where those folks that are really good at something actually don't think they're so good at it because they understand the complexity of the subject matter. And for those of us that may not be so good at something, we actually think we're better than we are because we just don't understand all the nuances. And in the event, one of the notes that came from that was that the best students struggle the most, which is a whole interesting topic. So, but in that note, as you can see, I can link to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is itself a separate note. I can link to the book, How to Take Smart Notes, which is where this idea is discussed. I link to another note on the imposter syndrome, which is related. So that kind of gives you at a high level how this system works. DevonThink is a relatively inexpensive software. And the book that I mentioned, How to Take Smart Notes in DevonThink, is an ebook that walks through how to use DevonThink and specifically in this note-taking system. You don't have to use DevonThink. Another app that I like that you may not have heard of is called The Brain. It's kind of a wild app that I've used off and on for years, but I think for this kind of note-taking system, for me, DevonThink is the best. But you could use Evernote. You could use, you could just create notes and put them in folders, but then link to each one, but that probably gets a little complicated. You could do it with paper and pencil, but you'd have a house full of index cards or slips of paper by the time you were done. So for me, DevonThink is the way to go. And it's already started to show its value, even for this podcast for me. What do I mean? Well, I have mentioned the bucket strategy before, and I'm actually in the next episode going to talk about the bucket strategy, so I won't dive into it in great detail now. But to say that there's always been some aspects about the bucket strategy that have troubled me, that I've just not been able to resolve. And as I've thought through it, and I have more reading to do, but as I've thought through it, I've come to believe that the bucket strategy, while it has some limited useful purposes in retirement, shouldn't actually drive the way in which we allocate our investments during retirement. I think it's actually a bad approach as an overarching approach to handling all of our investments in retirement. It has some purposes that can be useful, but it should not be the main driver. Now, that has come up through all of this note-taking as I'm reading and connecting ideas. And so it's actually already started to pay some benefits, this note-taking system. Again, I'll talk about the bucket strategy in the next episode, but kind of wanted to just share this with you. It's more like behind the scenes of my life, for better or worse, and what I've read this year, the note-taking system I'm using, how I'm using it. I've kind of just scratched the surface on it. But again, if you want to learn more about it, certainly How to Take Smart Notes, this book right here is a good place to start. And it's a very easy read. It's not particularly long. And if you wanted to use DevonThink, I would certainly recommend the ebook, How to Take Smart Notes in DevonThink. That's not inexpensive. I think I paid $50 for that ebook. Now it's 1,000 pages, so it's short pages, but almost like a reference book in a way. But I found it very, very useful. So that's the behind the scenes. That's what's going on here at Rob Berger headquarters. And I'm pretty excited about this. And now I've just got to go back to all of the books I've already read this year and skim through them for the most important ideas that hopefully I underlined when I read them and get them into the system. By the way, if you're wondering what I'm reading now, some of you will think as an English major, I should have already read this, but I'm reading the Iliad. And it's a phenomenal book, poem, I guess, really. But in any event, to my surprise, I thought it would be very difficult to read. And there are plenty of places and people in the book that I just basically skip over the names. But it's a very easy read, which kind of surprised me. Anyway, that's what I'm reading now. So there you go. Hey, hope you enjoyed this podcast. It gives you some sort of insight into what's going on in my world. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, rob@robberger.com. And of course, you can always comment in the Dough Roller Facebook group, doughroller.net/Facebook. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.